The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar midnight symphony as Marcus Chen pushed his cleaning cart down the marble corridors of Sterling Global Industries. His worn sneakers made soft squeaking sounds against the polished floor, a rhythm he had grown accustomed to over the past 18 months. The Fortituostery building stood nearly empty at this hour, save for the occasional security guard and the dedicated few still burning the midnight oil in corner offices. Emma sat cross-legged on the carpet in Conference Room B, her small frame dwarfed by the massive mahogany table that could seat 20 executives. Her homework was spread before her like a miniature battlefield, with math worksheets competing for space alongside a well-worn copy of Charlotte's Web. At 8 years old, she had already learned to make herself invisible during her father's night shifts, a skill that broke Marcus's heart even as it filled him with pride at her resilience. Marcus emptied the wastebasket near the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows, stealing a glance at his daughter. Her dark hair fell in gentle waves around her face as she concentrated, unconsciously tucking a strand behind her ear in the same gesture her mother used to make. The memory hit him like it always did, sudden and sharp, before he pushed it down and focused on the task at hand. The elevator dinged somewhere down the hall, followed by the sharp click of expensive heels against marble. Marcus tensed instinctively, knowing that late-night arrivals usually meant stressed executives and potential complications for his quiet routine. He had learned to read the building's moods through its sounds, the way a sailor reads the ocean through the wind. Emma looked up from her homework, her brown eyes curious. "Papa," she whispered, "why do the voices sound worried tonight?" Marcus paused in his cleaning, listening to what his daughter's keen ears had already detected. Muffled voices carried from the executive conference room 3 doors down, rising and falling in what sounded like heated discussion. "Just business talk, sweetheart," Marcus replied softly, though something in the tenor of those distant voices made his former professor instincts prick with attention. He had spent enough years in academic conferences to recognize the particular strain of cross-cultural miscommunication. "Keep working on your math, okay?" But Emma's head remained tilted, listening with the intense focus of a child who processed the world differently than most. The voices were speaking different languages now, she observed matter-of-factly, as if commenting on the weather. "Japanese and German, I think. And someone sounds very upset in French." Marcus felt his breath catch. His daughter's casual observation would have impressed his former linguistics colleagues, but here in the sterile corporate environment, her abilities felt dangerous, too remarkable for their carefully constructed invisible existence. He had worked hard to keep them both beneath notice, 2 more shadows moving through the building after hours. The executive conference room door opened with more force than necessary, and Robert Sterling's voice carried clearly down the hallway. "This is a disaster," he declared, his British accent sharp with frustration. 6 months of negotiations down the drain because nobody can seem to communicate like civilized human beings. The Tokyo team thinks we're being disrespectful, the Germans are offended by something the Americans said, and the French representatives are threatening to walk entirely. A woman's voice responded, calmer but equally tense. "Sir, perhaps we should consider bringing in professional translators tomorrow, or cultural consultants who can help navigate these sensitivities." Sterling's laugh was bitter. "Tomorrow? Sarah, this deal closes tomorrow or it doesn't close at all. $50 million hanging in the balance, and we're stumbling over linguistic hurt feelings like children in a playground." Marcus found himself frozen between his cleaning cart and the conference room where Emma sat, suddenly aware that their small world was about to collide with forces far beyond their control. His daughter had returned to her homework, but he could see the way her pen hovered over the paper, her attention clearly divided between mathematical equations and the unfolding drama down the hall. "Where in the world are you watching from tonight?" Marcus wondered silently, thinking of all the late-night workers and insomniacs who might understand the weight of invisible responsibility. "What time is it where you are?" as you listen to the choices that change everything in a single moment. The building settled around them with its nighttime creaks and sighs, while somewhere in the executive suite, $50 million hung in the balance of words that couldn't find their way across cultural divides. Marcus Chen, former professor of linguistics turned night janitor, stood at the crossroads between his carefully hidden past and an uncertain future, with his extraordinary daughter as the bridge between two worlds that had no idea they were about to meet. The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of Sterling Global Industries as Marcus guided his cleaning cart toward the storage closet. His shift would end soon, but the building was already stirring with the energy of another high-stakes business day. Emma walked beside him, her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders as they made their way to the employee exit. The elevator opened to reveal Robert Sterling himself, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expression thunderous. His blue eyes swept over Marcus and Emma as if they were pieces of furniture that had inexplicably learned to move. The janitorial staff, he muttered to his assistant, should know better than to bring children into the building during business hours. Marcus felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice level. "My apologies, sir. My daughter will be going to school now." He guided Emma closer to the elevator wall, making himself and his child as small as possible in the confined space. Sterling's gaze lingered on Emma for a moment before dismissing them both entirely. "This merger is hanging by a thread, Sarah," he continued to his assistant as if Marcus and Emma had simply vanished. "The cultural consultants we hired are useless, the translators keep missing nuances, and every conversation seems to create new misunderstandings. The Japanese delegation is convinced we're being deliberately disrespectful, the German team thinks the Americans are unprofessional, and the French are ready to walk away from the entire deal." The elevator dinged at the lobby level, and Marcus stepped out quickly with Emma, but Sterling's voice carried after them. $50 million, Sarah. The biggest acquisition in company history, and it's falling apart because people can't manage basic human communication. Emma tugged on her father's sleeve as they walked toward the building exit. "Papa," she said quietly, "the man in the elevator doesn't understand that the Japanese team is upset because someone used informal pronouns when addressing their senior negotiator. In Japanese culture, that's like calling an elder by their first name without permission." Marcus stopped walking, his heart hammering against his ribs. "How do you know that, sweetheart?" Emma shrugged with the casual confidence of childhood. "I heard them talking yesterday when you were cleaning the big conference room." The Japanese lady was explaining to her colleague why they felt insulted. She was speaking in Japanese, but her tone was very sad. The lobby bustled around them with early morning commuters and coffee-clutching executives, but Marcus felt as if he and Emma existed in a bubble of dangerous revelation. His daughter's innocent observation contained insights that could potentially save Sterling's failing merger, but sharing that knowledge would mean exposing abilities that he had worked so hard to keep hidden. Emma continued chattering as they walked toward her school, unaware of the storm her words had created in her father's mind. And the German man was frustrated because the Americans kept interrupting him during presentations. In German business culture, that's considered very rude. He told his assistant that American negotiators have no respect for proper protocol. Marcus listened with growing amazement and terror as his 80-year-old daughter casually dismantled the communication barriers that were destroying Sterling Global's most important deal. Her observations were sophisticated, culturally nuanced, and absolutely correct based on his own academic background in international linguistics and cultural communication. As they reached the school gates, Emma looked up at him with her mother's eyes. "Papa, why don't the business people just ask someone who understands both languages and cultures to help them talk to each other? It seems like they're all saying important things, but nobody is really listening." Marcus knelt down to her level, smoothing her hair with gentle hands. "Sometimes, Emma, people think they don't need help, even when they really do. They might not realize that understanding words and understanding meanings are two different things." Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened as she spotted her best friend across the schoolyard. "I have to go, Papa. Will you pick me up at 3:30? "Of course, sweetheart. Have a wonderful day." As Marcus watched his daughter skip toward the school building, her backpack bouncing with each step, he felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. In a few hours, he would return to Sterling Global Industries for another night shift, moving invisibly through corridors where $50 million hung in the balance of cultural misunderstandings that his daughter could solve with the innocent wisdom of a child who saw the world without the barriers that adults constructed around themselves. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the elementary school playground as Marcus waited by the familiar chain-link fence. Other parents chatted in small groups, their conversations a comfortable backdrop of carpools and weekend plans. He checked his watch nervously, knowing that in a few hours he would return to Sterling Global Industries, where the corporate crisis continued to unfold in languages his daughter understood better than most adults. Emma emerged from the school building with her characteristic bounce, her face bright with the enthusiasm that always followed a good day of learning. She rushed toward him, her backpack sliding off one shoulder as she navigated through clusters of departing children. "Papa," she exclaimed, breathless with excitement, "Mrs. Rodriguez taught us about different countries today, and I got to help when she couldn't remember how to say hello in Arabic. The other kids thought it was really cool that I knew so many ways to greet people." Marcus felt the familiar mixture of pride and anxiety that accompanied any public display of Emma's abilities. He took her backpack and began walking toward their modest apartment, listening as she chattered about her day with the unconscious joy of a child who had no idea how extraordinary she truly was. As they walked, Emma's expression grew more thoughtful. "Papa," she said, her voice taking on the serious tone she used when something puzzled her, "why was the sad man from this morning so worried about people not talking to each other properly? At school, when kids don't understand each other, the teachers help them figure it out." Marcus chose his words carefully, aware that his daughter's question contained depths she couldn't yet fathom. "In business, sweetheart, sometimes people think they're too important to admit they need help understanding each other. They believe that asking for help might make them look weak or unprepared." Emma considered this with the gravity of a child trying to understand adult logic. "But not understanding makes bigger problems than asking for help, doesn't it? If someone is accidentally being rude because they don't know the right way to be polite, wouldn't it be nicer to just explain the right way?" Her innocent wisdom struck Marcus like a physical blow. "Yes, Emma," he said softly. "It would be much nicer." They climbed the stairs to their second-floor apartment, the familiar creaks and groans of the old building welcoming them home. Emma immediately settled at the small kitchen table with her homework while Marcus prepared their simple dinner. The domestic routine felt precious and fragile, a carefully constructed normal life that could shatter if the wrong people discovered what his daughter could do. As Emma worked on her spelling words, she began humming softly under her breath. Marcus recognized the melody as a lullaby her mother used to sing, but Emma was humming it in 3 different languages, seamlessly transitioning from English to Spanish to French as if the linguistic boundaries that confined most people simply didn't exist in her world. "Papa," she said suddenly, looking up from her worksheet, "do you think the worried man from the elevator knows that when the French lady said his proposal was interesting, she actually meant it was terrible? In French, interesting can be a polite way of saying something is bad when you don't want to hurt someone's feelings directly." Marcus set down his coffee cup with trembling hands. "How do you know about the French lady, Emma?" "Oh, she was talking to someone on the phone when you were emptying the trash yesterday. She was speaking really fast, but she kept saying the English negotiators don't understand subtlety, and that their directness was making all the European partners uncomfortable. She sounded really frustrated, like when I try to explain something to Tommy at school but he doesn't listen to the important parts." The weight of his daughter's casual observations pressed down on Marcus like a physical force. Emma had absorbed, processed, and understood complex international business dynamics simply by existing in the same space as conversations conducted in languages most adults couldn't even identify. Her mind operated like a sophisticated cultural translation system, parsing not just words but meanings, intentions, and emotional subtleties that trained diplomats sometimes missed. Emma returned to her homework, completely unaware that she had just provided insights that could save Sterling Global Industries $50 million. She penciled in spelling words with the same concentrated attention she gave to everything, whether it was homework or the multilingual conversations that flowed around her like rivers of meaning waiting to be bridged. Marcus watched his daughter work, seeing her mother's gentle focus reflected in every careful letter she formed. The evening stretched before them, a few precious hours of ordinary family life before he would return to the corporate world where his brilliant child moved like a ghost through conversations that could change everything if only the right people knew how to listen. The Sterling Global Industries building hummed with tension as Marcus pushed his cleaning cart through the executive floor at 11:30 that evening. Emergency meetings had been called, and the usual after-hours quiet was replaced by the urgent energy of a corporation in crisis. Fluorescent lights blazed in conference rooms that should have been dark, and the coffee makers worked overtime to fuel desperate negotiations. Emma walked beside him, her homework finished hours ago, now carrying a small sketchbook where she drew pictures of the buildings they could see through the massive windows. She had grown accustomed to these late-night adventures, treating them like a secret world that belonged only to her and her father. The sound of raised voices echoed from the main conference room, where Robert Sterling's team had been locked in video conferences with international partners across multiple time zones. Marcus could hear the strain in Sterling's voice even through the heavy doors, the careful professional facade beginning to crack under mounting pressure. Emma paused in her sketching, her head tilting with the focused attention that always preceded her most insightful observations. "Papa," she whispered, "the German man is really angry now. He's using formal language, but his tone means he thinks the Americans are being disrespectful on purpose." Marcus glanced around nervously, making sure no one else was within earshot. "How can you tell, sweetheart?" Emma's eyes remained focused on some distant conversation only she could fully parse. "He keeps using sie instead of du when he talks to the American team, even though they were using informal pronouns yesterday. That means he's putting distance between them because he feels insulted. And he said something about Amerikanisch Arroganz, which means American arrogance." The conference room door burst open, and Robert Sterling emerged like a storm front, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his tie askew. Behind him, his assistant Sarah struggled to keep pace while juggling multiple phones and a laptop that seemed ready to slide from her arms. "This is catastrophic," Sterling declared to no one in particular, his voice carrying the weight of impending failure. "The Germans are threatening to withdraw, the Japanese won't return our calls, and the French delegation just informed us they're considering other offers. 6 months of work, Sarah. 6 months, and we're watching it disintegrate because nobody can navigate basic cultural sensitivities." Marcus moved his cleaning cart closer to the wall, instinctively making himself invisible while Sterling paced the hallway like a caged executive. Emma continued drawing, but her small fingers gripped the pencil tighter, and Marcus could see her processing every word of Sterling's frustrated monologue. "The merger was supposed to be announced tomorrow," Sterling continued, his British accent growing more pronounced with stress. "Board members flying in from 3 continents, press conferences scheduled, stock prices hanging in the balance. And instead of celebrating the biggest acquisition in company history, we're explaining to shareholders why we couldn't manage to communicate with our own partners." Sarah attempted to offer comfort. "Sir, perhaps if we delayed the announcement by a few days, gave the cultural consultants more time to repair the misunderstandings." Sterling's laugh was bitter. "The cultural consultants, Sarah? The ones who've been advising us for 3 months and somehow missed every single sensitivity that's now destroying our negotiations? The ones who assured us that our approach was perfectly appropriate for international business?" Emma looked up from her sketchbook, her brown eyes reflecting the hallway lights. "Papa," she said in a voice so quiet only Marcus could hear, "the cultural people don't understand that business language is different from social language. The Japanese team isn't really angry about the words, they're angry about the respect behind the words." Marcus felt his breath catch as his daughter continued her innocent analysis. "And the French lady yesterday wasn't saying the proposal was bad, she was testing whether the Americans could read between the lines. In French business culture, you have to prove you understand subtlety before they trust you with important decisions." Sterling had stopped pacing and was staring at his phone as if it might spontaneously provide solutions to his multilingual nightmare. The device buzzed with another message, and his expression darkened further. "The Tokyo team just cancelled tomorrow's signing ceremony," he announced to Sarah. "They cite ongoing concerns about cultural compatibility and mutual respect." Emma's pencil moved across her sketchbook, but Marcus could see that she wasn't really drawing anymore. Her artistic focus had been replaced by the intense concentration she showed when her remarkable mind processed complex linguistic puzzles. She was listening to conversations happening in rooms she couldn't see, understanding dynamics that trained professionals had missed, and translating not just words but the cultural intentions that gave those words their true meaning. The hallway fell quiet except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of Sterling's remaining team scrambling to salvage 6 months of work from the wreckage of miscommunication. Marcus stood frozen between his humble cleaning duties and the growing certainty that his 80-year-old daughter held the keys to solving a $50 million crisis that the most expensive consultants in the city had failed to address. The conference room blazed with emergency lighting as Robert Sterling and his team huddled around a speaker phone that crackled with the voices of frustrated international partners. Marcus had been cleaning the adjacent hallway for 20 minutes, moving slowly to avoid drawing attention while Emma sat quietly in an alcove, her sketchbook forgotten as she listened with the intensity of a child watching her favorite movie. The Tokyo delegation's voice emerged from the speaker, formal and distant. "Mr. Sterling, we must express our continued concerns about the cultural approach your team has demonstrated throughout these negotiations. We feel that fundamental respect protocols have not been observed." Sterling rubbed his temples, the weight of 6 months of work pressing down on his shoulders. "With respect, Mr. Tanaka, we have followed every protocol our consultants recommended. We've been nothing but professional and direct in our communications." Emma shifted in her alcove, her small hands clasping her knees as she absorbed the conversation with laser focus. Marcus could see the concentration in her posture, the way she tilted her head when parsing complex linguistic nuances that escaped most adults. The German delegation joined the call, their spokesman's voice carrying the clipped precision that Sterling had learned to associate with mounting frustration. "Mr. Sterling, we must also express our reservations about proceeding. The American team's approach to negotiations has been, how do you say, inconsistent with European business expectations." Emma's eyes widened with the expression she wore when she wanted to correct a misunderstanding at school but wasn't sure if she should speak up. Marcus moved his cleaning cart closer to the alcove, sensing that something was about to change in ways he couldn't control. Sterling's voice grew sharper with desperation. "Gentlemen, we're less than 12 hours from our scheduled announcement. Surely we can resolve these cultural concerns and move forward with the merger that benefits all our companies." The French representative spoke for the first time, her accent lending an air of finality to her words. "Monsieur Sterling, the issue is not cultural concerns, it is cultural comprehension. Your team speaks of respect but demonstrates unfamiliarity with the respect we require." Emma stood up abruptly, her movement so sudden that Marcus felt his heart skip. She walked toward the conference room with the determined stride of a child who had made an important decision. Marcus followed, panic rising in his chest as he realized what was about to happen. "Excuse me," Emma said, her clear voice cutting through the tense atmosphere as she appeared in the conference room doorway. The room fell silent, every face turning toward the small figure who had materialized like an interruption from another world. Sterling's expression shifted from surprise to irritation. "What is this child doing here? Security should have cleared all non-essential personnel hours ago." Emma stepped forward with the confidence of someone who knew she had something important to say. "Mr. Tanaka-san," she said, addressing the speaker phone with perfect pronunciation, "you're upset because the American team has been using casual language forms when they should be using respectful honorifics for someone of your senior position in the company hierarchy." The silence in the room became absolute. Sterling's mouth opened slightly, his brain struggling to process what he had just heard from an 80-year-old child who shouldn't have understood a word of the international negotiations. Emma continued, her voice steady and sure. "And Herr Mueller," she said, turning toward the phone with unconscious grace, "you're frustrated because the Americans keep interrupting your presentations, which violates German business protocol where senior speakers should be allowed to finish their complete thoughts before responses are offered." The German voice came through the speaker, uncertain and amazed. "How does this child know my name? How does she understand our concerns when your cultural consultants have failed to grasp them?" Emma looked up at Sterling with her mother's gentle eyes. And Madame Dubois, the French lady is testing whether you can understand indirect communication, because in French business culture, if you can't read between the lines in negotiations, they don't trust you to understand subtle contract terms later. Sterling stared at Emma as if she were speaking in tongues, which in a sense she was. Multiple tongues that carried the keys to unlocking the $50 million puzzle that had consumed his last 6 months. The child who had been invisible in his elevator that morning was now demonstrating a cultural and linguistic sophistication that his expensive consultants had failed to provide. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, watching his carefully constructed invisible life crumble as his extraordinary daughter stepped into the spotlight that he had spent 18 months helping her avoid. The conference room hummed with the electricity of revelation, while across multiple continents, international business partners waited to hear what an 80-year-old girl might say next. The conference room existed in a bubble of stunned silence as Robert Sterling stared at Emma with the expression of a man whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally challenged. His perfectly groomed corporate facade cracked as he struggled to process how an 80-year-old child had just articulated the precise cultural failures that his team of expensive consultants had completely missed. The speaker phone crackled with distant voices as international partners across 3 continents waited for someone to explain what had just happened. Emma stood in the center of the room with unconscious poise, her small hands clasped in front of her as if she had just finished reciting a poem at school rather than potentially saving a $50 million merger. Sterling found his voice first, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. How could you possibly know those names? How do you understand what these negotiations are about? Emma tilted her head with the patient expression she used when adults asked questions with obvious answers. I've been listening while Papa cleans the offices, she explained matter-of-factly. Business people talk really loudly when they're worried, and they forget that other people can hear them even when they're speaking different languages. Marcus stepped forward from the doorway, his face pale with the terror of exposure and the pride he couldn't suppress as he watched his daughter navigate the corporate crisis with remarkable grace. Mr. Sterling, he began, his voice carefully controlled, I apologize for the interruption. Emma, we should let the business people return to their meeting. But Sterling raised a hand to stop them, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. No, wait, he said, his tone shifting from irritation to something approaching wonder. Child, you said Madame Dubois was testing us. What kind of test? Emma brightened with the enthusiasm of a student who had been asked about her favorite subject. Oh, she was using what Papa calls diplomatic language, she explained. When French business people say something is interesting, they might mean it's good or they might mean it's terrible, and you have to understand the context and the way they say it to know which one they really mean. The French voice emerged from the speaker, tinged with amazement. Mon Dieu, this child understands more about international business communication than most corporate executives. How is this possible? Sterling's assistant Sarah stepped forward, her laptop clutched against her chest as if it might provide some rational explanation for what was unfolding. Sir, should I call security? This is highly irregular. Sterling waved her away without taking his eyes off Emma. Tell me about Mr. Tanaka, he said, his voice taking on the intensity of a man who suddenly realized he might be looking at his salvation. What did we do wrong with the Japanese team? Emma's expression grew serious as she considered the question. Mr. Tanaka-san is a very important person in his company, like a grandfather in a family, she explained with the clarity of someone translating between worlds. But your team kept talking to him like he was their friend instead of showing the special respect that important grandfathers deserve in Japanese culture. The Tokyo voice came through the speaker, formal but warmer than it had been all evening. The child understands Kigo, the respectful language forms. She recognizes the importance of proper hierarchy in business relationships. Sterling felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite identify. Hope, perhaps, or the dawning realization that the solution to his corporate nightmare might be standing in front of him in the form of a child who moved through his building like a ghost every night. Who is your father? He asked Emma, though something in his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect the answer would surprise him. Emma smiled with the uncomplicated joy of a child talking about her favorite person in the world. "Papa is the smartest person I know," she said. "He used to teach people about languages at the university before Mama got sick, and he knows how different cultures use words to show respect and kindness." The room fell silent again as Sterling processed this revelation. The janitor he had dismissed in the elevator that morning, the invisible man he had barely acknowledged as human, had been a university professor with expertise in exactly the field that Sterling's merger depended upon. The cultural consultants who had failed him so spectacularly had been rendered irrelevant by a custodial worker and his 80-year-old daughter who absorbed languages like other children absorbed cartoons. Marcus watched Sterling's face transform as understanding dawned, seeing the moment when prejudice collided with necessity and shattered into pieces that could never be reassembled. The careful invisibility that had protected his family for 18 months was dissolving in real time, replaced by a spotlight that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Emma looked between her father and Sterling with the innocent wisdom that had always been her greatest gift. "Papa always says that understanding people is more important than judging them by their jobs or their clothes," she observed. "Maybe that's why the business people have been having trouble talking to each other." The conference room had transformed into something resembling a linguistic laboratory as Emma stood at the center of a circle of corporate executives who were struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing. Robert Sterling loosened his tie, his usual composure completely abandoned as he realized that his company's salvation might depend on an 80-year-old girl who had been invisible in his building for months. Mr. Tanaka's voice came through the speaker from Tokyo, cautious but intrigued. "Young lady, you mentioned Kigo, the respectful language forms. Do you truly understand the difference between casual and formal Japanese communication?" Emma nodded with the confidence of someone discussing something as natural as breathing. "Of course," she replied, then switched seamlessly into flawless Japanese, her pronunciation precise and her tone perfectly calibrated for addressing a senior business executive. "Tanaka-san, I deeply apologize that the American team's informal language caused offense. They intended no disrespect, but they did not understand that using casual forms with someone of your distinguished position would be considered very rude in Japanese business culture." The silence that followed was profound. Sterling's mouth hung open as he watched a child who should have been in bed hours ago conduct international diplomacy with the linguistic sophistication of a trained ambassador. The Japanese voice that emerged from the speaker carried a note of genuine amazement. "Remarkable," Mr. Tanaka said, reverting to English. "The child's Japanese is not only grammatically correct, but culturally appropriate. She understands concepts that many Western business people never master." Emma turned toward the speaker with a small bow, a gesture so natural it seemed unconscious. Then she addressed the German delegation, her voice shifting into flawless German with the formal precision that their culture demanded. "Herr Mueller, the American team's interruptions during your presentations were not intended as disrespect, but rather as enthusiasm and engagement. However, I understand that in German business protocol, allowing senior speakers to complete their thoughts before offering responses shows proper respect for expertise and hierarchy." The German response was immediate and astonished. "Mein Gott, the child speaks German like a university student, not like someone who learned phrases from a textbook. Her understanding of our cultural expectations is extraordinary." Sterling found himself gripping the edge of the conference table as Emma continued her linguistic demonstration. She turned toward the phone where the French delegation waited, and her entire demeanor shifted subtly, taking on the sophisticated nuance that French business culture required. "Madame Dubois," Emma said in perfect French, her accent carrying the precision of someone who had absorbed the language rather than learned it, "I believe you have been testing whether the American team can understand indirect communication, because French business culture values subtlety and the ability to read between the lines as signs of sophistication and trustworthiness." The French response came through the speaker like music, warm and delighted. "Magnifique," Madame Dubois replied. "The child understands not just our language, but our business philosophy. She recognizes that we value intellectual finesse over blunt directness." Emma smiled with the pure joy of someone who had just shared her favorite toys with new friends. She looked around the room at the stunned faces of Sterling's team, then spoke in rapid Spanish to herself, as if thinking aloud. Papa always says that languages are like different ways of showing respect and kindness, she mused, then switched to Arabic with the same casual fluency, adding what sounded like a proverb about understanding before being understood. Sterling felt his legs give way and sank into the nearest chair. 7 languages, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. She just spoke 7 different languages as if she was choosing between different colors of crayon. Marcus stepped forward from his position near the doorway, his face a mixture of pride and terror as he watched his daughter's extraordinary gifts laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of corporate scrutiny. "Emma, sweetheart," he said gently, "perhaps we should let the business people continue their meeting now." But Emma was looking at Sterling with the earnest expression of a child who had just realized she might be able to help solve a problem. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom that always surprised adults, "the people on the phone aren't really angry about words. They're sad because they think you don't care enough to understand how they show respect in their cultures." "What part of this story resonates most with you?" she asked innocently, looking around the room. "Share your thoughts about how important it is to really listen to people, even when they speak differently than you do." The international voices began speaking simultaneously through the speaker, a chorus of amazement and possibility as business leaders across 3 continents realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. A child who moved through their world invisible and unnoticed had just demonstrated cultural and linguistic abilities that their most expensive consultants couldn't match. Sterling stared at Emma as if seeing her for the first time, which in many ways he was. The dismissive executive who had barely acknowledged her existence in the elevator that morning was gone, replaced by a man who understood that his $50 million merger might be saved by the extraordinary child of the janitor he had treated as furniture. The weight of revelation settled over the conference room like morning fog as Robert Sterling struggled to reconcile 18 months of assumptions with the reality standing before him. His eyes moved between Emma, still radiating the innocent confidence of a child who had just helped solve a puzzle, and Marcus, whose carefully maintained invisibility was crumbling under the spotlight of corporate necessity. Sterling's voice emerged hoarse with disbelief. "You said you were a university professor," he addressed Marcus directly for the first time that evening. "What university? What did you teach?" Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied any discussion of his former life. He had spent 18 months perfecting the art of deflection, but Emma's intervention had stripped away the protective barriers he had built around their past. "Northwestern University," he replied quietly. "Department of Linguistics and Cultural Communication. I specialized in international business protocol and cross-cultural negotiation strategies." Sarah, Sterling's assistant, looked up from her laptop with eyes wide behind her designer glasses. "Sir," she whispered urgently, "I just searched our database. Dr. Marcus Chen published extensively on multinational corporate communication. He was considered one of the leading experts in his field before he disappeared from academic circles 2 years ago." The conference room fell silent except for the hum of international phone lines carrying the voices of business partners who were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Marcus felt Emma's small hand slip into his, her unconscious gesture of support giving him strength to continue a conversation he had avoided for 20 months. Sterling leaned forward, his corporate instincts warring with his prejudices. "Dr. Chen," he said, testing the title that felt foreign after months of dismissing Marcus as invisible support staff. "If you have this expertise, why are you working as a custodian in my building?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but Marcus heard the genuine confusion beneath Sterling's professional facade. "His wife became ill," he replied simply, the words carrying the weight of grief that still felt fresh despite the passage of time. "Medical bills, insurance complications, extended leave that became permanent when budget cuts eliminated tenured positions. Academia doesn't forgive extended absences, even for family emergencies." Emma squeezed her father's hand tighter, her 80-year-old understanding of adult complications limited but her support absolute. "Papa had to take care of Mama," she added with the fierce loyalty that had always defined her relationship with her father. "And then he had to take care of me when Mama went to heaven. Being a papa is more important than being a professor." Sterling felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite identify but that felt uncomfortably like shame. The dismissive attitude he had maintained toward his custodial staff suddenly seemed not just unprofessional but morally bankrupt. He had spent 6 months paying consultants thousands of dollars for expertise that was mopping his floors every night. The German voice emerged from the speaker, breaking the emotional tension with practical urgency. Dr. Chen, if you understand international business communication, perhaps you can help us resolve these cultural misunderstandings before we lose this merger entirely. Marcus looked around the room at faces that had never truly seen him before, executives who were suddenly asking for help from someone they had treated as furniture. The irony was not lost on him, but Emma's presence beside him reminded him that some opportunities transcended personal pride. "I can try," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength as he stepped into a role he hadn't occupied in nearly 2 years. "But first, you need to understand that cultural miscommunication isn't about language proficiency. It's about respect systems, power dynamics, and the subtle ways that different societies express value and hierarchy." Emma nodded enthusiastically, her face brightening as she watched her father transform from invisible custodian back into the respected academic she remembered from their old life. "Papa knows that business isn't just about money," she explained to Sterling with the clarity of someone translating between worlds. "It's about people feeling respected and understood, and when people don't feel respected, they don't want to work together anymore." Sterling found himself leaning forward, suddenly desperate for insights that had been moving through his building unnoticed for 18 months. "Dr. Chen, what exactly did our team do wrong? How do we fix relationships that we didn't even realize we were damaging?" Marcus felt the familiar surge of intellectual engagement that had once defined his professional life. "The Tokyo team needs formal acknowledgement of the cultural oversight, delivered in appropriate honorific language," he began, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone who understood his subject completely. "The German delegation requires structured time to present their concerns without interruption, following proper protocol hierarchy. And the French team needs demonstration that your company can engage with subtlety and sophistication rather than blunt directness." The international voices began responding simultaneously, a chorus of agreement and possibility as business leaders across 3 continents realized they were finally hearing solutions rather than excuses. Marcus felt Emma's proud gaze on his face as he stepped back into the expertise that had once been his identity, transforming from custodial invisibility into the respected authority that their crisis demanded. The $50 million merger suddenly seemed possible again, not because of expensive consultants or corporate strategies, but because a father and daughter who moved through Sterling's world unseen had finally been allowed to share the gifts they had carried in silence. The elevator dinged softly at the executive floor, its doors opening to reveal Victoria Hamilton, CEO of Sterling Global Industries, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour and her dark eyes sharp with the alertness of someone accustomed to corporate crises. She had received Sarah's urgent text about breakthrough developments in the merger negotiations, but nothing had prepared her for the scene that greeted her as she approached the conference room. Through the glass walls, Victoria could see Robert Sterling leaning forward with desperate attention as a small child spoke animatedly to a speaker phone crackling with international voices. Beside the child stood a man in custodial coveralls whom Victoria recognized but had never truly noticed, his posture transformed from invisible service worker to commanding professional presence. Victoria paused in the doorway, her experienced eye immediately recognizing the shift in room dynamics that indicated something extraordinary was unfolding. 40 years in corporate leadership had taught her to read power structures and emotional undercurrents, and what she observed defied every assumption about hierarchy and expertise that typically governed her building. "Robert," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority that had built Sterling Global into an international powerhouse. "What exactly is happening here?" Sterling turned toward his CEO with the expression of someone whose understanding of reality had been fundamentally altered. "Victoria," he began, his voice still carrying notes of disbelief, "meet Dr. Marcus Chen, formerly of Northwestern University's Department of Linguistics and Cultural Communication, and his daughter Emma, who speaks 7 languages fluently and has just provided insights that our cultural consultants completely missed." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly, the only external sign of her surprise as she processed this information. She had built her reputation on reading people and situations quickly, and the scene before her suggested that her $50 million merger was being salvaged by individuals who had been moving through her building unnoticed for months. Emma looked up at Victoria with the unguarded curiosity of childhood, unintimidated by executive presence or corporate hierarchy. "Are you the lady who owns the building?" she asked with genuine interest. "Papa says you must be very smart to take care of so many people's jobs." Victoria felt something unexpected stir in her chest as she met Emma's earnest gaze. The child's innocent directness cut through layers of corporate formality with surgical precision, revealing the human foundation beneath business structures. "Yes, I help run the company," Victoria replied, crouching slightly to meet Emma at eye level. "And it sounds like you and your father have been helping us more than we realized." The Tokyo voice emerged from the speaker phone, formal but warmer than Victoria had heard in weeks of stalled negotiations. "Ms. Hamilton, we are honored to speak with you directly. Your Dr. Chen and his remarkable daughter have provided cultural insights that have illuminated the source of our communication difficulties." Victoria straightened, her mind racing as she began to grasp the magnitude of what had transpired. She had spent 6 months watching her merger deteriorate despite expensive consultants and cultural advisors, while the solution had been cleaning her offices every night. The irony was profound, but more important was the opportunity that now presented itself. Marcus stepped forward, his transformation from custodial worker to respected academic complete in everything except his uniform. "Ms. Hamilton," he said, his voice carrying the measured confidence of someone who understood his expertise, "the cultural barriers destroying your merger are not insurmountable, but they require authentic acknowledgement of the oversight and genuine demonstration of cultural competence going forward." Emma nodded enthusiastically, her small hands clasped as she looked between the adults who were finally listening to insights she had carried for months. "The business people aren't really fighting about money," she explained to Victoria with the clarity of someone translating between worlds. "They're fighting about feeling respected and understood, and that's something Papa is really good at helping people with." Victoria felt the pieces of a complex puzzle clicking into place as she observed the dynamic between father and daughter. Emma's extraordinary linguistic abilities were remarkable, but Marcus's expertise in cultural communication was exactly what her company needed, not just for this merger, but for future international expansion. She had been searching for someone who could bridge cultural divides while her solution had been emptying her waste baskets. The German voice joined the conversation from the speaker, his tone carrying new notes of optimism. "Ms. Hamilton, we are prepared to continue negotiations if Dr. Chen can provide the cultural guidance that has been missing from this process. His daughter's insights have already resolved misunderstandings that have plagued us for weeks." Victoria looked at Marcus, seeing him clearly for the first time despite 18 months of his invisible presence in her building. "Dr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying the weight of executive decision-making, "I think we need to have a conversation about your role in this company. Your expertise appears to be exactly what Sterling Global requires for successful international operations." Emma beamed with pride as she watched her father receive the recognition that his abilities deserved. She turned to Victoria with the innocent wisdom that had characterized all her observations. "Sometimes the most important people are the ones nobody notices," she said matter-of-factly. "Papa always says that every job is important, but some people forget to see the person doing the job." The conference room hummed with possibility as Victoria Hamilton, one of the most powerful executives in the country, found herself face to face with extraordinary talent that had been hiding in plain sight. The merger that had seemed doomed hours earlier was suddenly viable again, not because of corporate strategies or expensive consultants, but because a father and daughter who moved through her world unseen had finally been allowed to demonstrate the gifts they had always possessed. The conference room had transformed into an international diplomatic center as Emma positioned herself near the speaker phone with the confident posture of someone who understood her unique role in salvaging the $50 million merger. Victoria Hamilton observed from her position near the window, watching with fascination as an 80-year-old child prepared to facilitate negotiations between some of the world's most powerful business leaders. Marcus stood beside his daughter, his academic expertise finally recognized and valued, ready to provide the cultural context that had been missing from months of failed negotiations. The weight of corporate expectations pressed down on both of them, but Emma seemed remarkably unaffected by the pressure, treating the international crisis with the same focused attention she gave to her homework. Dr. Chen, the Tokyo voice emerged from the speaker, formal but expectant. We are prepared to continue discussions if you can provide assurance that cultural protocols will be properly observed going forward. The respect issues must be addressed before we can proceed. Emma looked up at her father, who nodded encouragingly, then addressed the phone with perfect Japanese pronunciation and cultural sensitivity. "Tanaka-san," she began, her young voice carrying surprising authority, "on behalf of Sterling Global Industries, we deeply apologize for the cultural oversights that caused offense to you and your distinguished colleagues. The American team's informal language was not intended as disrespect, but we understand that impact matters more than intention." The response was immediate and warmly surprised. "The child demonstrates proper understanding of accountability and face-saving protocols," Mr. Tanaka replied in English, his tone noticeably warmer than it had been all evening. "This acknowledgement addresses our primary concerns about cultural competence." Emma turned toward the German delegation with seamless fluency, her entire demeanor shifting to match their preference for formal structure and hierarchy. "Herr Müller," she said in perfect German, "we request the opportunity to hear your complete presentation without interruption, following proper German business protocol that honors expertise and seniority." Victoria watched Sterling's face transform as he witnessed Emma effortlessly navigating cultural nuances that had destroyed months of his careful work. The child was not simply translating languages, she was translating entire worldviews, building bridges between different concepts of respect, hierarchy, and business relationships. The German response carried genuine enthusiasm. "Ausgezeichnet, excellent," Herr Müller replied. "The child understands that German business culture values thoroughness and proper process. We appreciate this demonstration of cultural learning." Emma's attention turned to the French delegation, and her posture subtly shifted again, taking on the sophisticated elegance that French business culture demanded. "Madame Dubois," she said in flawless French, "we recognize that your testing of our cultural sophistication was appropriate and necessary. French business wisdom requires proof of intellectual finesse before trust can be established." The French response was musical with delight. "Magnifique, ma petite diplomate," Madame Dubois replied. "The child demonstrates the subtle understanding that we require from serious business partners. This is most encouraging progress." Marcus stepped forward, his voice carrying the academic authority that had once defined his professional identity. "What Emma has demonstrated," he explained to the room and the international partners, "is that successful global business requires more than language translation. It requires cultural translation, understanding not just what words mean, but what respect looks like in different societies." Sterling found himself taking notes frantically, suddenly desperate to capture insights that his expensive consultants had failed to provide. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice carrying new respect, "how do we ensure that future negotiations avoid these cultural pitfalls?" Emma answered before her father could speak, her young voice carrying wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond her 8 years. "You have to remember that every culture has different ways of showing they care about people," she explained with the clarity of someone translating between worlds. "If this touched your heart, let us know where you're listening from and subscribe for more stories about understanding each other across differences." The international voices began responding simultaneously, a chorus of agreement and renewed partnership as business leaders across 3 continents recognized that they were finally communicating with true understanding rather than corporate formality. The merger that had seemed impossible hours earlier was suddenly not just viable, but strengthened by the cultural bridges that Emma and Marcus had built. Victoria Hamilton moved closer to the conference table, her experienced eye recognizing that she was witnessing something unprecedented in her 4 decades of corporate leadership. The solution to her company's most complex international challenge had come not from boardrooms or consulting firms, but from the extraordinary gifts of a father and daughter who had been moving through her building invisible and unnoticed. Emma looked around the room with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully completed a difficult puzzle. "The business people are happy now," she observed to her father with innocent pride. "They understand that they all want the same thing, they just needed someone to help them say it in ways that everyone could hear. The conference room buzzed with the electricity of transformation as Robert Sterling stared at the speaker phone that now carried voices of renewed partnership instead of frustrated withdrawal. The $50 million merger that had been disintegrating hours earlier was suddenly solid again, built on foundations of genuine cultural understanding rather than corporate assumptions. But the weight of his own behavior pressed down on Sterling like a physical force, demanding acknowledgement that went far beyond business success. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor beside the conference table, her sketchbook open as she drew pictures of flags from different countries, each one representing the voices that had been speaking through the phone. Her casual contentment contrasted sharply with the emotional turmoil visible on Sterling's face as he struggled with the magnitude of his prejudice and oversight. The Tokyo voice emerged from the speaker with formal satisfaction. Dr. Chen and young Emma, your cultural guidance has transformed these negotiations completely. We are prepared to proceed with the merger announcement as scheduled, with full confidence in Sterling Global's international competence. Marcus felt Emma's small hand slip into his as the German delegation added their agreement. Her Dr. Chen, Herr Müller said with Germanic precision, your expertise and your daughter's remarkable abilities have resolved months of miscommunication in a single evening. This is precisely the cultural bridge building that international business requires. The French voice carried musical warmth as Madame Dubois spoke. Mon cher docteur, we insist on expressing our gratitude personally. Your child has demonstrated sophistication that puts many professional diplomats to shame. We look forward to working with Sterling Global under your cultural guidance. Sterling rose from his chair slowly, his usual corporate confidence replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like humility. The transformation was visible to everyone in the room as the executive who had dismissed Marcus and Emma in the elevator that morning faced the reality of how wrong he had been about everything that mattered. Dr. Chen, Sterling began, his voice rough with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond professional courtesy. I treated you and your daughter as invisible, as less than human, while you possessed exactly the expertise that my company desperately needed. Emma looked up from her drawing with the patient expression she used when adults said obvious things. It's okay, Mr. Sterling, she said with the generous forgiveness of childhood. Papa says that sometimes people don't see clearly until they need help, and then they remember that everyone is important. But Sterling shook his head, his face flushed with shame that 18 months of prejudice couldn't be dismissed so easily. No, Emma, it's not okay, he replied, his voice gaining strength as he accepted responsibility for his actions. I judged your father by his uniform instead of his abilities. I looked right through both of you without seeing the extraordinary people you are. Marcus stepped forward, his voice carrying the dignity that had sustained him through months of invisibility. Mr. Sterling, he said quietly, what matters now is not the past, but what we do going forward. Emma and I are grateful for the opportunity to help, and we understand that recognition sometimes comes in unexpected ways. Victoria Hamilton moved closer to the group, her executive presence commanding attention as she addressed the international partners through the speaker phone. Gentlemen, Madame Dubois, she said with the authority that had built her corporate empire, I want to personally assure you that Dr. Chen will be taking a senior role in our international operations, with full authority to guide our cultural communication strategies. The international voices responded with enthusiastic approval, each delegation expressing their satisfaction with Sterling Global's commitment to genuine cultural competence. Emma beamed with pride as she listened to the praise for her father, her small chest swelling with the joy of seeing his abilities finally recognized and valued. Sterling turned toward Marcus with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal remorse. Dr. Chen, he said formally, on behalf of Sterling Global Industries, I formally apologize for the disrespect you and Emma have endured. Your contributions tonight have saved not just this merger, but potentially our entire international expansion strategy. Emma stood up from her drawing and walked over to Sterling with the fearless directness of childhood. She looked up at him with her mother's gentle eyes and spoke with wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond her 8 years. Mr. Sterling, she said softly, Papa taught me that everyone makes mistakes, but good people try to do better when they learn they were wrong. You're trying to do better now, so that makes you a good person. The simplicity of her forgiveness hit Sterling like a physical blow, bringing tears to his eyes as he knelt down to Emma's level. "You're right, Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to do better, and I want to make sure that your father gets the respect and recognition he deserves." The speaker phone crackled with the voices of international partners who were witnessing something unprecedented in their collective decades of corporate experience. A business merger had been saved not by financial incentives or legal maneuvering, but by the extraordinary cultural gifts of a father and daughter who had been overlooked by the very people who needed them most. Marcus looked around the conference room that had become a stage for transformation, seeing faces that would never again dismiss him as invisible furniture. The merger was saved, his expertise was recognized, and his daughter's remarkable abilities were finally valued rather than hidden. But more important than any of that was the knowledge that they had used their gifts to build bridges between people who had been separated by misunderstanding and prejudice. 3 weeks later, Marcus Chen stood in his new office on the 42nd floor of Sterling Global Industries, looking out through floor-to-ceiling windows at a city that seemed transformed by possibility. The nameplate on his door read Director of International Cultural Relations, a title that carried both the weight of corporate responsibility and the satisfaction of recognition finally received. Sunlight streamed across the mahogany desk where Emma sat working on her homework, her legs swinging from a chair that had been specially adjusted to her height. The office bustled with the quiet energy of important work as Marcus reviewed cultural briefings for upcoming negotiations with partners in 12 different countries. His expertise, hidden for 18 months beneath custodial coveralls, now guided Sterling Global's international expansion with the authority and respect that his abilities deserved. The transformation felt surreal, but Emma's presence beside him provided the continuity that made everything feel possible. Victoria Hamilton knocked softly on the open door, her silver hair catching the afternoon light as she entered with the easy confidence of someone who had made a decision that validated her reputation for recognizing talent wherever it existed. "How are you both settling in?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine warmth rather than corporate formality. Emma looked up from her math worksheet with the bright smile that had charmed international business partners across 3 continents. "Ms. Victoria," she said enthusiastically, "Papa's new office has windows that look over the whole city, and I can see the school from here. It's like being in a castle tower where you can watch over everyone you care about." Victoria laughed with the genuine delight of someone who had discovered that corporate success could be enhanced rather than diminished by human connection. "And how do you like your new role as our unofficial cultural consultant?" she asked Emma with mock seriousness. Emma giggled with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. "I like helping people understand each other," she replied. "Papa says that when people speak different languages but share the same dreams, someone just needs to help them find the words that work for everyone." Marcus felt the familiar surge of pride as he watched his daughter effortlessly navigate relationships that had once seemed impossibly complex. The merger had been successfully completed the previous week, with all international partners expressing unprecedented satisfaction with Sterling Global's cultural competence. But more important than any business success was the knowledge that Emma's extraordinary gifts were now valued and encouraged rather than hidden. Robert Sterling appeared in the doorway, his expression carrying a humility that had replaced his former arrogance completely. The transformation in his attitude had been remarkable to witness, as if recognizing his prejudice had freed him to become a better version of himself. "Dr. Chen," he said respectfully, "the Tokyo team has requested that you and Emma participate in their next quarterly review via video conference. They want to ensure that cultural protocols are properly maintained as we integrate our operations." Emma perked up with interest, her natural curiosity about different cultures making every international interaction feel like an adventure rather than work. "Can I wear my blue dress with the flowers?" she asked her father seriously. Mr. Tanaka said that blue is considered peaceful and professional in Japanese business culture. Marcus smiled at his daughter's careful attention to cultural details that most adults overlooked entirely. "Of course, sweetheart," he replied, smoothing her hair with gentle hands. "Your thoughtfulness about cultural respect is exactly what makes these partnerships successful." Victoria watched the interaction between father and daughter with the satisfaction of someone who had made a decision that enhanced both her company's capabilities and her own understanding of what truly mattered in business. "Dr. Chen," she said, "the board has approved the expansion of your department. We want to establish Sterling Global as the international standard for cultural competence in global business." The afternoon sun slanted lower through the windows as Emma packed up her homework, chattering about the cultural presentation she was preparing for her class about how different countries express friendship and respect. Her teacher had been amazed by her insights and had requested that she share her knowledge with other students, turning her linguistic gifts into educational opportunities that benefited everyone. Marcus looked around his new office, seeing in every detail the validation of 18 months spent moving invisibly through the same building that now welcomed his expertise with open arms. The nameplate, the windows, the respectful attention of colleagues who had once dismissed him as furniture, all represented a restoration of dignity that went far beyond professional recognition. Emma tugged on her father's sleeve, her brown eyes bright with the contentment that came from being truly seen and valued. "Papa," she said softly, "do you think Mama would be proud of us now?" Marcus knelt down to his daughter's level, seeing in her face the same gentle wisdom that had first attracted him to her mother years ago. "I think Mama would be amazed by how brave and kind and brilliant you've become," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And I think she would be happy that we found a place where our gifts are appreciated and our family is valued." As they gathered their things to head home, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from invisible custodial work to respected international consulting. The path had been difficult, marked by loss and struggle and months of careful invisibility, but it had led them to exactly where they needed to be. The Sterling Global building hummed around them with the energy of international commerce, but now Marcus and Emma moved through its corridors as valued contributors rather than invisible shadows. Their extraordinary gifts had found their proper place in a world that finally understood that talent and worth could be found in the most unexpected people, speaking in languages that bridged not just words but cultures, dreams, and the fundamental human need to be truly understood.